Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video, and today we are doing part 2 of the story of Azazel. If you didn't manage to catch part 1, do check in the top right hand corner now, or you'll find a link down in the description below. I do think you should definitely watch that one before you watch this one, but without further delay, let's conclude the tale of Azazel. 10 years had passed, and Sigmar, king of the Unborogan, had become an emperor, and at his northern shore, a new threat to his nascent empire emerged. It was Saphael, an envoy for the now emperor, who saw them first. A trio of dark ships slid from the mist like phantoms. Tapered hulls, angled upwards with wolf-headed prows, arched towards the shore, driven by banks of oars that swept up and back in perfect unison. Panicked shouts came up from the settlement of Hogvarric on the Empire's northern shore. The Norse had come. Women carrying children were fleeing along the roadway of packed earth that led to the stockade on the hill. Streaming from the forest around the settlement were at least 200 warriors in patterned cloaks of red and green, with heads shaven except for long braids at their ears. Each man was armored in a mail vest and bore a small wooden buckler and a wide-bladed sword. Ropsmen. The women cried out in relief at the sight of the Ropsmen. Tribal warriors from the east, who, while not sworn allies of the Empire, were certainly more welcome than the Norse. A swordsman in form-fitting silver armor who bore twin blades of slender beauty led the Ropsmen, and Saphael recognized a deadly killer with his every step. A dark suspicion formed in his mind, however, as the warriors took up positions in the heart of the village on the road that led to the stockade. Saphael shouted a warning, but it was already too late. The Ropsmen fell upon the women with swords, and the screaming tore at Saphael's heart. He dragged his own weapon from its sheath and ran at the nearest of the Ropsmen, plunging the blade into the man's side. Even as he died, the man lashed out at Saphael, who leapt back to avoid a killing blow from the dying man's weapon. Another Ropsman warrior lunged at him, and Saphael swept his blade aside and spun around, slashing his sword across the back of the foe's knees. Hamstrung, the man collapsed with a foul scream, and Saphael tore the man's buckler from his arm. The Ropsman circled him, and Saphael knew he couldn't hope to survive the fight. "Right, you bastards," he yelled. "Who's next?" A shaven-headed Ropsman with a scarred face raised his sword, but the silver-armored swordsman shook his head. "No," he said. "This one's mine." The warrior circled Saphael, and his courage fled as he recognized the lithe footwork of an expert swordsman in the man's every move. Saphael, in his travels, had once been privileged to witness a display of Ostrogoth Droyosak blade masters who elevated sword combat to an art form. Next to this man's fluid movement, they seemed like crippled simpletons. "You should be honored," said the warrior. "You will be my first." "First what?" said Saphael. "The first Empire man I will kill." "Ha! You are arrogant," said Saphael, mustering the last shreds of his warrior spirits. "Perhaps I'll kill you." The man laughed and shook his head. "No, already fear is turning your bowels to water, and you know you do not have the skill to defeat me. A fight is about more than just skill. There's luck and fate. You might slip, your sword might break, I could surprise you." "No, you won't." The man removed his helm, and Saphael's jaw dropped at the sight of the wondrously handsome man before him. Lustrous dark hair was bound in a long scalp lock. It was the man's face, sinuous and perfectly symmetrical, that snared Saphael's attention. Handsome to the point of obscenity. The man's features were clearly not those of the Norse tribes. His curving cheekbones, full lips, and softer jaw spoke of southern tribal ancestry. Saphael was a lover of women and had no interest in men beyond their comradeship, but he felt an undeniable attraction to this beautiful man. "Who are you?" whispered Saphael, his sword lowering. The swordsman's blade lanced out in a gleaming blur, and the rush of blood poured onto Saphael's chest. He looked down and saw that his throat had been opened. The blade that killed him, so sharp he hadn't even felt it, cut his flesh. He dropped to his knees, and his life poured out of him. The swordsman stood over him, and Saphael was glad that his death had come at the hands of this perfect warrior, and not some stinking, traitorous ropesman. I am Azazel, said the swordsman, but before that, I was called Geryon. Raphael tried to form a reply, but his mouth filled with blood, and the words wouldn't come. I once called this land home, Azazel said, kneeling beside him and unsheathing his dagger. But I was betrayed and driven out by a man who called me sword brother. His name is Sigmar, and I have come home to kill him. Azazel gripped Raphael's neck and held the glittering blade of his dagger a hair's breadth from his eye. As the last of his strength faded, Raphael saw the swordsman's face twist in anger, and what he had once thought beautiful was now hideous and terrifying. I am going to put out your eyes and cut out your tongue, hissed Azazel with obvious relish. You will walk blind and without voice in the void for all eternity. Your torment will be exquisite. The dagger stabbed home, and Raphael knew no more. Hogrovik burned. The stockade on the hill had fallen within the hour, and its chieftain was nailed to its splintered gates. His wife and children were thrown still living onto the pyre of the dead. The elders and warriors were impaled on sharpened logs that had once encircled the hill fort, and the women too old to bear children were given to the bloodied warriors for sport or taken by Azazel for torture. The young women were whipped and chained before being taken aboard the woolship as spoils of war. The settlement's children were offered to Karnath, the dark god of blood, and their skulls woven into trophy chains, to be hung from the banner of Cormac Bloodaxe. Car Odderson watched as the settlement burned, pleased at the victory. The wizen, stoop-shouldered shaman sat on a fallen log, as Cormac stalked through the blazing village, his powerful form clad in blood-colored armor, taken from the lost tomb of Varag Skulltaker the previous year. The warrior's axe, a dread blade into which Car Odderson had bound a creature from the pit, was dark and lifeless, its hunger for slaughter sated for now. With eyes that saw the world beyond that of mortals, Car Odderson perceived the red haze of anger that enveloped Cormac and smiled. That anger had been a potent force in the rebuilding of the Norsey tribes, an anger that Car Odderson had carefully fanned and built ever since Cormac's father had been killed and the Norsey driven from their homes by Sigmar Heldenhammer. Forever on the fringes of the southern lands, the Norsey had honored the ancient gods of the world, and for this they had been hated and feared. The soft-bellied southern tribes knew nothing of the power of the northern gods, and so they were prey to the Norsey. Then, the hated Sigmar had united the tribes beneath his banner, and made war on the chosen of the gods. Against such a powerful enemy, the Norsey had no choice but to flee to the icy wasteland across the sea. Here, they scraped a pitiful existence from the bleak landscape, dreaming of a day they would sing the songs of war, and sail the wolf ship south to bring death to their enemies. Alone, of all the Norsey, Car Odderson embraced his new home, for he had travelled these forsaken lands before in ages past. Centuries before Cormac's birth, Car Odderson had dared venture into the northern reaches of the world, where the very air seethed with power, and the land writhed with the breath of the gods. Unimaginable energies had poured into his body, the gods blessing him with extended life and the power to change the world. The elements bent to his will, demons of the pit were his to command, and the myriad patterns of the future came to him in dreams and visions. Upon his return to the world of men, he walked upon the Norsey for many lifetimes, shaping their destiny, and ever working to bring about the end times. The days of blood when the dark gods would finally claim this world as their own. Car Odderson had held to the old ways, and with Cormac's anger binding the Norsey together, they had rebuilt the tribes, gathering the survivors of Sigmar's wrath, and filling their hearts with hatred. With the coming of Azazel, that time was closer than ever before. Car Odderson looked over the burning hill fort as the young warrior walked from its ruins. He stopped beside Cormac, and the two warriors made their way towards him. As they drew close, Car Odderson studied them both. Cormac Bloodaxe was greatest of the North Sea warlords, a warrior who had brought many of the disparate tribes of the north together under one banner and promised them revenge. A core of molten rage burned in his heart, and that anger would burn the Empire to ashes. Azazel's silver armor was drenched in blood, and lines of red streaked his cruelly handsome face. The man reveled in torture, and the burning fort was filled with the mutilated bodies of his victims. The swordsman had come a long way in the 10 years since his arrival on their shores, in a stolen boat, delirious and near death. The womenfolk nursed him back to health, and as soon as he regained his strength, Car Odderson took the warrior into the northern wastelands, deep in the abode of the gods. Azazel fought creatures of nightmare and felt the blessings of the gods flow in his veins. The warriors had been reborn there, and like Cormac, Azazel had good reason to hate the Empire. His thirst for vengeance was a sword aimed at the heart of its ruler. It had been hard for Cormac to accept the Southlander as an equal, but in the years of battle, since he had first come to their lands, Azazel had proved himself a warrior of superlative skill and ruthlessness. His cruelty and beauty were feared and beloved in equal measure, and he had willingly turned from the weak gods of the southern tribes to worship the hungry gods of the dark. "A grand day's slaughter," said Car Odderson as the two warriors reached him. "This," spat Cormac, removing his helm, "this was nothing." Cormac Bloodaxe had the face of a fistfighter, his nose a flattened nub of gristle that had been broken many times, and his eyes were hooded and malicious. His hair was the color of copper, and his skin was wind-blown from a life lived in the tundra of the northern realms. Cormac bore numerous tally scars on his cheek, each one representing a great mound of skulls offered to his patron god. He looked over at the line of impaled prisoners. "There was barely a warrior among them, save the clansman I killed at the shore," Cormac said. "The chieftain opened his gates after we slew the first of his women. A man like that does not deserve to be a leader." "The men of the Empire are sentimental," said Azazel. "It will be their undoing." "Exactly," agreed Car Odderson. "They do not live a life of battle and blood like the North Sea. Comfort and peace makes women of their warriors." "You were once of them," pointed out Cormac, never passing up an opportunity to remind Azazel of his southern heritage. "I have yet to see your sentimental side." Car Odderson expected anger from Azazel, but the man simply shrugged. "I cast off such weakness when I killed my sister," Azazel muttered. "I am no longer one of them. I am North Sea." "Aye," said Car Odderson, "that you are. Tell me, Cormac, did the ropesmen fight well?" Cormac shrugged. "Well enough. They know what will happen to their womenfolk should they falter." Car Odderson smiled. With the breaking of the ice around the Norscan coastline, Cormac and Azazel had sailed the warships across the ocean and plundered the towns and settlements of the ropesmen. They had taken the ropesmen women and tribal leaders hostage and demanded a season of servitude from the eastern tribes' warriors in return for their safety. It was a bargain Car Odderson had no intention of living up to. He sensed Azazel's dark eyes boring into him. "The ropesmen must know you will not return their hostages," said Azazel. "You will burn them upon a great pyre to ensure the success of next year's campaigning." As always, Azazel's beguiling allure gave Car Odderson pause, but he forced himself to see past the haunting beauty the Dark Prince had bestowed upon the swordsman. "You see much that is hidden, Azazel," said Car Odderson. "You have the sight." Azazel shook his head and smiled. "I don't need sorcerer's powers to know that you will kill them," he said. "It's what I would do." Slowly. Car Odderson smiled. Truly the man Geryon was no more. Only Azazel, disciple of Shornal, remained. "It matters not," said Car Odderson. "There is nothing they can do to prevent it. But time is passing, and we should leave this place. The smoke will bring warriors from other settlements." "Let 'em come," snarled Cormac. "I grow weary of killing women and old men, shaman." "Yet you take such relish in the task," retorted the shaman. "Carnath cares not from where the blood flows," spat Cormac. "But we gain nothing by killing such wretches. My blade hungers for worthy foes to slay. You must be patient, Cormac. This is not a time for war. It is a time for terror. Terror is a potent ally, Cormac. It moves through the land faster than any army, and saps the courage of every man it touches. Your name is known in the South already, for it is carried on every panic scream and cry of loss. The terror of what you have done here will spread like a plague, and tales of your slaughter will reach the furthest corners of the Empire. With every retelling, they will grow in magnitude, until your terror gnaws at the hearts of Sigmar's warriors like rats in the darkness. Then it is time to march south. Then it's time to march south, asked Cormac. No, not yet. There is work to be done before the Empire burns. Damn you, Shaman. You say that every time I ask. What is left to be done? Patience, young Cormac. You have nursed your hatred for 10 years. What matters one more turning of the seasons? Tell me, Shaman, or I shall feed your soul to my axe. Very well, said Carodison, feigning submission, though he knew his death would not be at the hands of the mortal like Cormac Bloodaxe. There is an enemy that dwells in the south, who draws powers from the pulse of the earth. A sorcerer like you? No, hissed Carodison. Not like me. There are no others like me. But this one has real power. And the gods have spoken words of death that cannot be denied. Then kill this mystic and be done with it. I shall, promised Carodison. I must travel deep into the lands of the south. But I shall not be going alone. Azazel must accompany me, for he knows the ways of its people, and he shall be my guide and protector. And then we take the fire south, demanded Cormac. Then we take the fire south. In the Brackenwalsh, the crone Garion went to see all those years ago pondered on her life. Once a seer, a teller of the future, her gifts had now left her. That age should undo her rather than the wiles of her enemies was no bad way to end a life that had been lived for the good of others. Her steps had taken her along some dark roads, and she had done much that she was not proud of. But the race of man had endured, and she would not second-guess the choices she had made for the greater good. The image of a young woman with dark hair leapt to her mind, but she quashed the thought before it could fully form. That had been a necessary sacrifice. A death required to set Sigmar on the path of the birth of the Empire. Had Ravina lived, the Greenskins would now rule this land of men, and all that she had fought to save would have come to ruin. Is that how you sleep at night? The thought took her by surprise. She had long since come to terms with Ravina's death. More and more she found her thoughts skipping randomly around her mind, revisiting memories and past regrets thought long buried. She was an innocent, and you killed her. No, thought the hag woman, as she turned from the path towards a ragged black rock that jutted from the marshland, like a sunken mountain that left only its topmost peak visible. The ground leading towards a black cleft in the rock was soggy underfoot, and a wrong step in any direction would see her sucked beneath the bog. And she reached the mouth of her cave and paused, taking a last look at this magnificent day. This world was harsh and unforgiving, yet it was also beautiful and miraculous. If you knew where to look, wonders could be found in every corner, and she would miss it when she was gone. The hag woman ducked her head and entered the cave, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the shadowy interior. She moved deeper into the cave, allowing sense memory to guide her in the dim light. The smell of herbs and heat came to her, reassuring in their familiarity, and following hot on their heels was the smell of cold iron, sweat, and the dust of travel. The hag woman halted, realizing she was not alone. Orange light flared in the darkness, and a crackling fire appeared in the circle of stones that had served as her hearth. A wizened old man sat cross-legged before the fire, his head bowed and his hands stippled before him as though in prayer. She narrowed her eyes, needing no witch sight to tell this man was more than he seemed. The breath of the dark gods filled this one, and his power was palpable. "Who are you?" she asked. "A traveler who walks a similar path to you, Grianne." The hagwoman startled at the use of her given name. "No one has called me that in many years. How is it you know it?" "The dark gods know your name, and have spoken the words of your death," said the old man, raising his head and looking at her with cold eyes that had seen the passage of centuries and the slaying of thousands. She swallowed and reached deep into herself for any last shreds of power that remained to her, knowing that she would only have one chance to fight him. But before she could move, strong hands seized her and held her fast. "Remember me?" said a silky, seductive voice at her shoulder. The hagwoman twisted in her captor's grips, but her struggles lessened as she saw the face of the man holding her. He was wondrously handsome, with a beautifully cruel grin that was beguiling and yet curiously repellent. Though the light was poor, there was no mistaking the young man who had come to her cave many years ago in search of vengeance. Lost innocence hid behind his killer's eyes, but beyond that, a hidden face shone with unspeakable desires and monstrous arrogance. With a sinking heart, she knew it was his true self, and she marveled that she had not seen it before. These were not the eyes of a man, they were the eyes of a demon. She turned away, and the old man laughed. "She remembers you, Azazel. That is not your given name, Geryon," she whispered, knowing it would do no good. "It is now," hissed Azazel, drawing his knife and holding it to her throat, "and it will be the last name you hear as you die." It was dark by the time the old man had decided they had come far enough. Though her hands were bound, Geryon, she could not think of him as Azazel, held her fast the entire way, whispering the terrible things the old man was going to do to her. The hagwoman had thought that death would hold no fear for her, but that had been foolish on her part. She did not want to die like this. The night sky was cloudless, the stars bright pinpricks in the velvet darkness, and she saw that they had traveled almost to the very edge of the marsh. Somehow the old man had known the secret route through the deadly swamps. The moon's reflection shimmered on the surface of the water, and its uncaring face bathed the silent landscape in a pale, dead glow. "How did you find your way through the marshes?" she asked. "The paths are unknown to most men." "I am not most men, Grianne," said the old man. "Your powers may be gone, but you can still tell that, can't you?" "You followed the dark gods," she said. "I follow the true gods," he replied. "The gods that rule in the realm beyond this ashen existence, and whose breath fills me with life. They are the real power in this world, not the feeble avatars dreamed up by the minds of men. They existed before this world, and they will exist long after it is dust in the void. If you're going to kill me, then tell me your name." "At least tell me that," she said. "Very well," shrugged the old man. "I am Car Odderson of the Iron Walls, shaman of Cormac Bloodaxe of the North Sea." "You're a long way from home, Car Odderson of the Iron Walls. What makes you think you will live long enough to return? You are deep in unbroken lands, and Sigmar's hunters are very skilled." "As am I, woman," hissed Geryon. "I knew this land well enough to escape those hunters before, and I will do it again. No man can match my skills and cunning." She laughed and twisted in his grip. She saw the raging desire to kill her in his eyes, and the chance to escape the fate Car Odderson had planned for her. "You think you evaded them?" she asked. "Sigmar sent no one after you. He let you go to honor Ravina's memory." "You lie," said Geryon, and the hag woman relished the flinch she saw at the mention of his sister's name. The sister he had killed. The sister she had sacrificed to temper Sigmar's ambition with determination. The hag woman sagged in his grip. "I feel sorry for you, Geryon," she said. "You lost Tranavantes, and then Ravina. That must have been hard. You were a pawn in a grander plan, but I did not foresee what those losses would drive you towards. Nor did I see that I would pay for your fall with my death. I do not want your pity, woman," pushing her to her knees, "and call me Geryon again, and I will gut you right now." The hagwoman spat in Geryon's face. "I should have strangled you with your mother's cord when you were born," she said. "I told her that one of her sons would grow to know the greatest pleasure and the greatest pain. If she had known you would murder her only daughter, she would have begged me to kill you while you slept in her belly." Geryon slammed his fist into her face, and bright light exploded before her eyes. Her nose and cheekbone broke, and tears streamed down her face. She fell on her side, feeling the dank wetness of the marshy ground on her skin. She coughed up a wad of blood and marsh water as Geryon hauled her upright. Your sister knew your soul was sick, but she had still tried to help you, the hagwoman said through the pain. You repaid her goodness by sticking a sword in her belly and ending her life before its time. She would have borne strong children and been a mother of kindness and strength. Geryon drew his knife, the blade hovering an inch from her eyeball. Do not mention her name again, he screamed. Why? Because you cannot face the horror of what you did. My sister was a slut, yelled Geryon, the killing lust of the demon behind his eyes flaring with rage. She opened her legs for Sigmar and deserved to die for that. I was the greater man. She should have loved me. I loved her with all my heart, and she spurned me. She knew your true face, Geryon, said the hagwoman. That is why she rejected you. No, hissed Geryon, his shoulders shaking with the effort of control. She loved me, and I know what you are trying to do. It will not work. Geryon looked up, and Kar Otterson dragged her to the edge of the marsh, his strength surprising for so wizened a man. There is no escape for you, said the shaman. The Dark Prince has claimed the one you knew as Geryon. I know you see this, and it pleases me for you to know that you gave birth to this. How does it feel to know that every soul Azazel has sent screaming into the next world, and every soul he will kill during his immortal life, is thanks to you? You created Azazel, and for that, I thank you. The hagwomen wanted to spit defiance at Kar Otterson, but she knew he was right. Her designs had shaped Geryon into a vessel into which the shaman of the Iron Walls had poured venomous evil and corruption, making him easy prey for a creature from beyond the veil. She had done this, and now she would pay the price for all eternity. Do it, she said. No last words for hate's sake, smiled Kar Otterson. What would be the point? A chance to feed the self-righteous you that moves you to meddle in affairs that do not concern you? Suggested Kar Otterson. You are no different from me, shaman, said the hagwoman. You meddle with the fate of the world, and will come to no better end than I. I already know how I will die, said Kar Otterson. It holds no fear for me. Defeated, the hagwoman sagged in Geryon's grip. I did the best I could to guide mankind, she said. I did what I thought was best at the time, and I would do the same again. So arrogant, said Kar Otterson. So like you to excuse your actions. No, said the hagwoman. I make no excuses. Very well, said Kar Otterson, bending to pick up a fist-sized rock. Then let it be done. She saw a flash of iron in the moonlight, and her eyes widened as hot blood poured down her front. Geryon held her upright as her body began to convulse. Even as she felt the pain of the cut, Kar Otterson smashed the rock against her temple. Bone cracked and was driven into her brain. Fresh blood streamed down her face. Her mouth worked soundlessly as the life drained from her body. But before either of her wounds could send her down into death, Geryon turned her around and pushed her body down into the brackenwalsh. Black water rushed into her mouth, and even as her lifeblood poured out to mix with the marsh water, the pain in her head was incredible, and she buckled and heaved against her killer's grip. It was dark beneath the water, and she could see the wavering image of stars and the moon through the churning water. They were laughing as the thrice death claimed her. Once Azazel and the shaman returned to the ranks of the North Sea, they marched south. Sigmar rode out to meet them, although his army was not at full strength, having not gathered all his bannermen to him as of yet. He felt he had enough to drive back the Norscan tribes. He was wrong. The Empire lost. Their casualties numbered 1,000 compared to less than 300 amongst the Norscans. The army of the Empire retreated to Middenheim. Pyres burnt. Pyramids of skulls were built long into the night, and Cormac watched the bloody torture of the prisoners. Their screams were prayers to the dark gods, and the forest echoed to the chants and prayers of the North Sea. Drunk on slaughter and victory, thousands of men filled the shallow valley where they had faced the might of Sigmar and prevailed. The Emperor had never been defeated, and the men of the Empire fully expected to crush the invaders in one great battle. Though he hated to admit it, Kar Oddison's plans and the training regime of Azazel, who had spent the last 2 seasons teaching the Norse the Empire way of war, had borne fruit. Cormac relished the sense of panic that seized their foes when they had seen the Norse fighters as a disciplined whole. Kar Oddison's host of shamans had worked their sorceries to bring the heavens down upon the enemy, and their doom was assured. The slaughter had been mighty, and he had given an equal share of living plunder to each of their vassal warlords. The Kull had initially disemboweled their captives, and hunchback shamans with gibbering shadows at their shoulders had eaten the entrails. Groups of Way 2 riders attached the ropes to the limbs of prisoners and rode off in different directions to tear them apart, while Khazag strongmen pummeled their prisoners to death with their fists. Cormac had fought and killed 24 warriors in a hastily dug battle pit ringed with swords. With bare hands and naked ferocity, he had beaten each prisoner down and drunk their blood as it gushed from their necks, torn open with his teeth. The Hung had violated their captives in every way imaginable, and then given their broken, abused bodies to the slaves as playthings. Of all the fates suffered by the prisoners of the Empire, this was one that had offended Cormac the most. Every warrior, even an enemy, was entitled to a death of blood, his skull offered to the brass throne of Carnath. Kar Oddison placated him by speaking of the myriad aspects of the Dark Gods, and how each was honored differently. Were not the reeking plague pits of the Onagol a means to serve the gods of the north? Though they took no skulls in battle, the shamans who ventured into the madness of the far north and returned twisted and insane with power were just as devoted to the old gods. The pleasure cults of the Hung were no less honorable, elaborated Kar Oddison, though they seemed so to Cormac's eyes. Besides, as Azazel had pointed out, Cormac could ill afford to invite dissent into his army by keeping the Hung from their sport. Its unity was a fragile thing at best, and to single out the worshippers of Shamal would start a rot that would see the entire army break up within days. Cormac threaded his way through the camp, pausing every now and then to watch a particularly amusing or grotesque sacrifice at a makeshift altar. His skin was hot and red from the pyres, for there was plenty of wood to burn. In time, the Empire would be one gigantic pyre, with the skull of its emperor mounted on a giant pyramid of bone and ash. As he reached the head of the valley, he saw Kar Oddison and Azazel. His mood soured, for he could not look upon them without thinking that they plotted behind his back. A shaman and a traitor of his own kind. Such lieutenants he had. A brutalized corpse lay at the shaman's feet, and from the hideous mutilations wrought upon its flesh, the corpse's belly was opened, and Kar Oddison's hands were buried in its intestines. With a wet, sucking sound, Kar Oddison removed a glistening liver and turned it over in his red hands. "What do the entrails say?" asked Cormac, and Azazel only reluctantly tore his eyes from the ruptured corpse. Cormac was about to ask again when Kar Oddison held up a hand. "Be silent," said the shaman. "The art of haruspex requires concentration." Cormac fought the urge to take his axe and bury it in the shaman's head for such disrespect. Releasing the iron grip on his weapon, he hadn't been aware he was holding it. "It was a good victory," said Azazel, gazing rapturously at his own image in the gleaming metal of his sword. "Hard fought and well won." Cormac nodded, unsure whether Azazel was talking to him or the reflection. He forced himself to answer without anger. "Aye, it was that," he said. "Many skulls, and fresh trophy rings for every champion." "It's a shame you did not capitalize on it," said Kar Oddison without looking up from his reading of the dead man's meat. "Discipline broke down at the end, and our enemies escaped us. Now we will need to fight those men again," said the shaman. "Then we will fight them again," hissed Cormac, "and we will defeat them." "I wouldn't be so sure about that," said Azazel. "We beat Sigmar's men because they were not ready for us to fight like them, but they will learn from that mistake." Cormac tried not to look at Azazel, and waited for the shaman to speak. Did you hear me? Asked Azazel. I heard you, snapped Cormac, finally meeting the swordsman's gaze. As much as he detested the rites of Shamal, the Dark Prince's power must surely have shaped Azazel's features. To raise his voice in anger to such a specimen of perfection seemed abhorrent. He forced himself to look past Azazel's glamours to the corruption beneath. I thought your training made us equals in combat, Cormac said. Azazel laughed, and such was its beguiling quality that Cormac felt his anger melting in the face of such a wondrous sound. Hardly, Azazel flashing him a smile. We have trained for little more than 2 seasons. Sigmar's men have trained and fought together for years. Your army outnumbers Sigmar's, said Kar Otterson, and the power of the dark gods makes us invincible. No, it makes us vulnerable, said Cormac. That makes no sense, hissed Kar Otterson. My power has never been greater. It's a mistake to think yourself invincible, Shaman. Overconfidence will see us defeated. Think like that, and we will make mistakes, leave openings for the enemy to exploit. We must assume nothing, and expect our enemies will come back from this defeat stronger and more prepared. The Master of the Empire is no fool, and he will surely learn from his humbling. Then what do you think Sigmar will do next? Asked Azazel. He will fall back to Middenheim, said Cormac. It is his only option. Azazel nodded. I will climb to the heavens and tear him down from his lofty perch. No, you won't, said Cormac. At least not yet. Azazel's expression hardened, and his eyes grew cold. What? Our enemy is within reach. Why do we not strike for his throat? Because it is what he will expect us to do, exclaimed Cormac. Sigmar must win time for his forces to gather. He will do so by drawing us onto the walls of an impregnable city. Then what do you suggest? My blades ache for Sigmar's body, said Azazel. That we do not dance to his tune. We ignore Middenheim and push eastwards, burn the forests and the villages of the Empire, and seek out the forces answering Sigmar's call for aid. Destroy them one by one, and soon tales of our victories will draw more of our kin from across the sea. Within a season, we will see the Empire in flames. No, said Kar Otterson, rising from the corpse and holding the liver out for them to see. Its hard, fibrous interior was yellow with sickness. You are mistaken. That will not happen. What do you mean? Demanded Cormac. Kar Otterson stroked the liver, stringy ropes of rancid pus dripping from his fingers. We follow Sigmar to Middenheim, said the shaman. That is a mistake, said Cormac. We can destroy the Empire without facing the Emperor in battle until we have taken everything from him. You think this is about the Empire? Snapped Kar Otterson, his bitter gaze sweeping over Cormac and Azazel. It is not. It is about Sigmar. You think you fight for lost lands, for revenge? No. This war is the first of many, and all others will hang upon it. Though I dislike the thought of leaving Sigmar in his mountain city, Cormac's plan has merit, said Azazel, and Cormac was surprised at the swordsman's support. Cormac's plan? Hissed Kar Otterson. Since when do the tribes of the north heed the word of a mortal man? He is a warlord and a champion of this host by the will of the gods, and when they speak, he must obey. Then what is the will of the gods? Asked Cormac, fighting down his killing urge. The shaman's eyes took on a glazed faraway look, and his voice seemed to echo from a place or a time far distant. The flame of Ulrich must be extinguished, and Sigmar must die. I have seen ages beyond this time of legends, to a place where darkness closes in on the world, and the forces of the old gods stand poised to bring ruin upon the world. The final triumph of chaos is at hand, but one name holds back the darkness, one name of power that gives hope to men and bolsters the courage of all who hear it. That name is Sigmar. And if we do not destroy him, here and now, then his name will echo down the centuries as a symbol for our enemies to rally behind. Cormac felt a shiver of dark premonition travel the length of his spine as the forest around his army trembled with motion. His first thought was that Sigmar's army had returned in the night to fall upon them as they gave thanks for their victory, but that thought died as he saw what emerged from the tree line. Thousands of beasts that walked, crawled, and flew stood illuminated in the firelight, completely encircling the Northmen army. Blessed by the warping power of the dark gods, no two were alike, a glorious meld of man and animal, armed with crude axes, rusted swords, or studded clubs. They had come at the shaman's call, a host of monsters with snarling heads of wolves, bears, bulls, and a myriad of other forms that defied easy identification. As one, they split the night with their howls, brays, and shrieks, and Cormac's sense of might and power as master of this army retreated in the face of such atavistic devotion to the old gods, primal and devoid of any urges save to destroy and revenge themselves on a race that hated and feared them. The beasts were ready to tear the throat out of the Empire. "These are the days of great power," said Kar Otterson. "The tribes of the north, the beasts of the forests, and the great prince of Karnath will fall upon Middenheim, and we will baptize this world in blood." The army of Cormac Bloodaxe began the assault on Middenheim at dawn the following day. After a night of braying howls, echoing war horns, sacrificial pyres, and blood offerings, their chants and songs of war drifted up to the defenders, promising death and rich with primal urges of the gathered Norsey tribes. Where the men of the Empire craved peace and the warmth of hearth and home, the Norsey craved battle and conquest. Where progress and development were the watchwords of the Empire, slaughter and the lust for domination drove the northern tribes. The gods of the south watched over their people in return for worship, but the baleful gods of chaos demanded worship and offered only battle and death to those who venerated them. 8,000 Empire warriors stood ready to defend the city, around half the number opposing them. More than just men were poised to attack. An army of beasts accompanied them, and they bellowed alongside packs of slavering, black-furred wolves and towering troll creatures lumbering through the host with clubs that were simply trees ripped from the earth. As the men of the Empire watched from atop their mountain fortress, a rhythmic booming echoed from far below. The northern tribesmen banging axes and swords against shields as they marched up the viaduct. Monotonous chanting droned in counterpoint to the clash of iron and the howls of monstrous beasts, completed the dreadful, courage-sapping noise. It was the sound that spoke of destruction for destruction's sake, the urge to kill and maim for no reason other than the suffering it would cause. No courage or faith a man might possess could fail to be shaken by such a noise, for it had been the primordial sound of mankind's doom since the beginning of the world. Surrounded by these horrors was Falstag Rock, the mountain upon which the town had been built. The army below swarmed its sides, clawing their way up an impossible face of sheer rock. Sigmar had climbed this rock once, and it had almost killed him, but these monsters ascended with no more trouble than a man might climb a ladder. The morning was only a few hours old, and the Empire god of death, Mor, had come to claim the souls of the fallen time and time again. The enemy dead were thrown from the viaduct, and screams of the wounded warred with the battle chants of the Norsemen. Each charge was a furious scramble of blades and blood, screams and courage, with Sigmar killing dozens of frenzied Norsey champions seeking his head. Cormac felt the blood run down his face, relishing the taste of it, even as the stink of dead flesh turned his stomach. He was naked but for a loincloth, and the tanned color of his skin was instantly obscured by the crusted blood that covered every inch of his flesh. His arm ached from sawing through meat and bone, yet he could not deny the exhilaration that filled him as he stood in the center of the pit. The pit was precisely 80 yards wide and 8 deep, filled with severed heads to the height of the man's waist. Every corpse that had fallen from the mountain spire of Middenheim since the battle had been joined was dragged here and decapitated. Day after day, Cormac had hacked the skulls from the fallen and hurled them into the pit. Kar Odison had spoken of a great prince of Karnath, and such a mighty avatar of the blood god demanded great honor. The ground underfoot was thick with coagulated blood and rotting flesh peeled from the skulls of men and beasts alike. Warriors and champions from every tribe surrounded the pit, each with a dagger poised at the throat of his fiercest warrior. Only the most vicious killers would serve as sacrifices, for a sacrifice was not a sacrifice if it was not valued. Cormac had woken this day, with his veins throbbing and his vision streaked with red, as though an endless gourd of blood was being slowly poured over his head. The taste of it was in his throat, and a rabid fury filled his heart. He had felt a similar sensation in the tomb of Varrig Skulltaker, and he had felt it when Kar Odison bound the dark spirit to his axe. Cormac now saw that those moments had been hollow and meaningless, pale echoes of the bloodlust that now coursed through his body. Mighty powers had turned their eyes upon this mortal world with ominous ambition, and Cormac's heart soared at the thought of being their mortal champion. His axe growled and hissed, and the fell spirit bound within the blade, also sensing that this day was special. Today promised bloodletting like no other. Today, he would fight alongside one of the mighty demon lords of Karnath. Kar Odison had sought him out at first light, and the moment he caught sight of Cormac, his eyes widened with a mixture of fear and awed reverence. "It is time," said the shaman. Word had spread through the camp, and the assault on Middenheim was forgotten, as warriors, beasts, and monsters were drawn to the pit to witness this great and terrible sorcery. Alone among Cormac's warriors, Azazel and the Hung had not come to share this glorious moment, for their master was Shornal, the ancient god most hated by Karnath. To be a devotee of the Dark Prince at the birth of one of the blood god's avatars would be suicide. Cormac had ritually taken the skulls of 8 times 8 captives, holding their severed heads above his own, and letting the blood drain onto his iron-hard flesh. Each baptism had sent his heart racing, and when he dropped into the pit of heads, he felt the thinness of the air, as though he could tear down the wall between this world and the void with his bare hands. The day was silent, no sounds of life or passage of moments, for the powers pushing into this world were the bane of all living things. Cormac could feel the pressure within his skull like the coming of a storm. He welcomed it. For this was a storm of blood, a storm of blades, and a storm of skull-taking. He looked upon Kar Odison, the shaman's wizened features, energized by the power being drawn to the pit. Cormac blinked as his vision blurred. The world around him began to turn red, as though his eyeballs were filling with blood. The sensation was not unwelcome. For the first time, Cormac could see the breath of the gods roaring over the earth, clouds of red howling soundlessly around him like smoke in a storm. He touched everything with rage and hatred, pride and glory. Nothing was left without its boon. The breath of Karnath was everywhere, in every act of violence, every act of martial pride, and every act of spite. Every mortal heart was touched by it, and he laughed as he saw the top of Middenheim was just as wreathed in the breath of the blood god as his own army. "I feel it!" he roared, a red fury of power surging in his veins. Kar Odison raised his arms, and the red mist gathered around the shaman, drawn to him as he gave voice to a host of guttural, primal syllables that sundered the air with their horror and rage. Instinctively, Cormac knew these were the first words of death, the sounds of the first murder, and the echoes of Karnath's birth at the dawn of all things. The shaman nodded, and the champions of the north sliced their blades across the throats of their willing victims. Blood jetted from 100 opened throats, and the air was rent by howls, roars, and cries in honor of the great god of battle and blood. But death alone was not enough, and the blades hacked through sinew and bone to sever each head. Cormac gasped as the heads were hurled into the pit with him. Ruby droplets spat at him as they bounced and tumbled over the decaying carpet of skulls. The howling red clouds were drawn up into a towering spiral of crimson, like a bloody vortex that reached from this poor, tasteless realm to the abode of the gods. How Cormac ached to climb to that domain of murder and hew skulls in the name of the blood god. But this moment was not for him to transcend, but for something far older and far more terrible to tread the soil of this mortal earth. Cormac felt it pass from its own existence to his, and threw back his head as he welcomed the avatar of Carnath with a bellowing roar of bloody devotion. The pit began to fill with gore, as though an endless lake of blood was flooding through the invisible tear in reality. Forking traceries of light flashed in the sky, and crimson bolts of lightning slammed into the pit. The blood boiled, and the earth screamed as something ancient and abominable poured its essence into the world. The presence in Cormac's skull intensified 1,000-fold, and he screamed in agony, collapsing into the mass of severed heads that floated in the lake of blood. The jostling skulls and the blood swallowed him as his flesh burned with invention. Too late, he realized his mistake. His role in this was not to fight alongside a Lord of Carnath. His role was to become one. Up in the city of Middenheim, Pendrag, Sigmar's longtime sword brother, and now Count of Middenland, was charged with guarding one of the city gates, as he saw men who only moments ago had been fighting like heroes of legend, fleeing from a monstrous shadow that filled the sky with its terrible bulk. It moved too fast to see, its blood-matted hide reeking of death and ancient rage, enormous wings of darkness, brass and iron, the smell of charred flesh and wet fur. Blood burst from Pendrag's mouth and nose. He vomited over the cobbles. The shadow fell over the viaduct, the doom of his race made real, and Pendrag wept as its deathly power washed over him. He scrambled for his fallen weapon, and no sooner had his fingers closed on the runefang hilt than the suffocating fear fled his mind. His blade crackled with power, and he felt its ancestral hatred of the enveloping shadow. The Norsey screamed a name, a violent, filthy sound that clawed at the air like fingernails on slate. But it now held no power over Pendrag, for he bore a weapon of ancient times. No matter that it had been newly forged, this was a weapon that had always existed. Sometimes as a sword, sometimes a flint spear or bronze-bladed axe. But through all the ages of the world, this weapon and its as-yet unmade brothers had always been here to fight the corrupted power of the dark gods. Pendrag stood tall amid the helpless defenders of the viaduct, and the runefang blazed with the purest light, a brightness to conquer the blackest night and banish the deepest of shadows. He thrust the sword to the sky and smote the darkness with its blade. Sunlight broke through as the terrible shadow fell towards the center of the city, and the warriors of the Empire clambered to their feet as the power of the runefang gave them strength. The Norsey charged, and Pendrag's eyes were drawn to the warrior leading them. He wore a form-fitting silver armor that shone wondrously in the light, and flowing black hair spilled gloriously around his shoulders. The warrior bore twin swords of dazzling brightness, and as he skillfully rolled each blade in his grip, Pendrag was struck by the familiarity of the move. Sigmar had claimed Ravina's murderer was among the Norsey, but until now Pendrag had thought that impossible. Clean-shaven and pristine, he was monstrously out of place amongst the Norsey, and Pendrag's heart skipped a beat as he saw the image of his old friend Tranavantes in the warrior's face. "Geryon," he whispered. Though 50 yards or more separated them, Geryon seemed to hear him, and a smile of breathtaking beauty slid across his face as he angled his course to meet Pendrag. Of the 100 men who stood with Sigmar, fully a third dropped dead with the terror at the sight of the abomination that landed in their midst. Others fled, leaving only a staunch few able to overcome their fear. Like the darkest desires of men and beasts knitted together in a nightmare, it was a creature of darkness, dragged into the light by the dreams of blood. It stood 4 times the height of a man, on back-jointed legs, its body vast and muscled. Sheathed in bronze and iron, its flesh was the brutal color of charred corpses, and the stink of the grave was pressed into its wiry fur. The blunt wedge of its honed head was filled with serrated fangs, and its eyes were like holes pierced in the flank of a volcano. Enormous wings of smoking darkness spread out behind it, and the flagstones shattered as its enormous weight landed. It clutched a bronze axe in one meaty fist, and a writhing whip like a cat o' nine tails in the other. The ends of the barbed whip's lashes ended in wailing skulls that dripped blood from their empty eye sockets. "Demon," Sigmar said, and the colossal beast roared, baring its fangs and shaking the foundation of Ulrich's temple. "Here I am, demon," yelled Sigmar. "Fight me." The demon heard him and swung its shaggy horned head towards him. Death lived in its eyes, death and an eternity of suffering and pain. Sigmar's spirit quailed before such awesome destructiveness, but he heard a freezing wind howl in his mind, and the winter ice filled his veins in answer to the fires of this demonic foe. Redwayne, a white wolf and warrior companion of Sigmar, leapt in with his hammer to strike at the demon's knee, howling as the iron head of his weapon exploded against the demon's armor, and Redwayne fell back as razored fragments tore at his exposed face. The demon's fist lashed out, catching Redwayne on the shoulder and sending him spinning through the air with a horrific crack of shattered bones. With a howl of all the wolves of Ulrich, Sigmar sprinted over the tumbled stones of the temple and hurled himself through the air towards the demon. Galmoral spun in his grip as he brought it around in a devastating overhead sweep. The ancient dwarf-forged star metal arced towards the center of the demon's face, and Sigmar knew this would be the blow to end this vile creature's existence forever. The demon's fang-filled mouth opened wide as its whip flicked up with as many lashes coiling around Sigmar like the grasping arms of a monstrous kraken. They tightened on him like barbed coils of wire, and his armor buckled beneath its enormous strength. Sigmar screamed in pain as bony thorns pierced his flesh in dozens of places. The world spun around him, ground, sky, walls, cold burning fire. Sigmar slammed against the floor of the temple with bone-crushing force. Galmoraz spun away from him, coming to rest before the flame of Ulrich. The lashes of the whip slithered away like guilty snakes, leaving bloody trails behind them. He heard screams of pain and fear, and rolled onto his back, every nerve in his body shrieking with agony. His arm was useless, and he scrambled backwards on his haunches towards his warhammer. Black shadows gathered over the Temple of Ulrich, and the demon's black outline loomed over him. Back on the viaduct, the Norsees smashed into the defenses. Within seconds, it was clear that a hastily built wall they had constructed would not hold. Enraged by the same darkness that had so terrified the men of the Empire, the howling tribesmen killed with savage ferocity and madness, each fighting as though to outdo their fellow warriors. Swords and axes clashed in desperate battle, and scores of men died in the opening moments. The defenders fought for their lives, while the Norsey fought for the chance that their ancient gods might notice their bravery. Pendrag sliced the runefang through the neck of an armored warrior, his heavy plate of iron no protection against Ulrich's masterful blade. Another blow cut through the helmet of a warrior with golden skin and an oversized axe. His sword moved like quicksilver, cutting and stabbing without pause. He saw Geryon ahead of him, and the swordsman caught his eye and smiled with feral anticipation of their duel. The Empire line was bowing back from the walls, and although Pendrag's men were fighting with renewed courage and determination, he saw that it wasn't going to be enough. Pendrag moved through the Norsey as though they were no more than clumsy children, leaving his assigned protectors, the White Wolves, behind as he killed without mercy or second thought. Next to his graceful sweeps and deadly lunges, the Norsey were lumbering buffoons, slow-witted and without skill. A burst of shimmering silver flashed beside him, and he brought the runefang around in a sweeping block as a glittering blade slashed towards him. He spun around, his sword held out before him, but his battle fury faltered in the face of this magnificent foe. "How about you try that pretty little sword against a real opponent?" said Geryon. Pendrag tried to reply, but words failed him at the changes wrought upon the man he had once called brother. Geryon's skin was white, like the finest porcelain, and his hair was darker than the deepest starless night. The sounds of battle faded until all Pendrag could see was the perfect, enrapturing figure before him. It was the eyes that held him, so full of innocence, yet brimming with cruelty and utterly without pity. Pendrag was enthralled by Gerion's eyes, appalled by beauty that should have aroused, but instead evoked nothing in his soul but revulsion. Gerion's sword slashed for his throat, but the runefang swept up and parried the blow without conscious command. No sooner had the sword touched than the spell holding Pendrag transfixed was broken. The frantic clash of iron and screaming swelled like a tide around him. "I'll gladly cut you down, Gerion," snarled Pendrag, thrusting the runefang towards the swordsman. His attack was easily batted aside, and Gerion laughed with musical amusement as he bounded lightly from foot to foot. "My name is Azazel. Gerion is dead." "Gerion, Azazel, whatever damn name you go by, I'll still kill you," replied Pendrag as he launched an attack again. Gerion swayed aside, parried another stroke, and launched a dazzling riposte. Pendrag flinched as Gerion's sword sliced the braids from his beard. "I do so love your pathetic confidence," smiled Gerion, spinning his swords in a terrifying display of skill. "It's so much sweeter to kill someone who thinks they have a chance." "Try your best," challenged Pendrag. "Gladly," said Gerion, attacking in a furious ballet of blades. Pendrag blocked desperately as Gerion's sword snicked the skin of his neck, cheeks, and forehead. "Fight like a man," he roared, blocking another slicing blow. The runefang blazed in his grip, its power surging as it empowered him to fight this dread foe. Pendrag drew on every reserve of courage in his heart, and the runefang steeled his will to resist the dark allure of the swordsman's beauty. Never in Pendrag's life had he fought with such skill, power, and speed, but instantly he knew it was nowhere near enough to defeat Gerion. "You cannot win, Pendrag," hissed Gerion, rolling his right blade around the runefang and slicing another braid from Pendrag's beard. "You must see that I am far more skillful." "Skillful, aye," said Pendrag, backing away along the fighting step, "but I have something you don't." "Oh?" chuckled Gerion, "and what's that?" "Friends," said Pendrag. He relished the look of confusion on Gerion's face as Otwin's axe swept down and crashed into the swordsman's back. Otwin, the first Elector Count of the Drakwold, and who'd been previously known as the Berserker King, had driven Gerion to his knees by the force of his blow, his reflective armor intact, yet cracked from neck to abdomen. A graceful sword thrust struck Gerion in the chest as Count Marius of the Teutons leapt into the fight. The swordsman fell against the parapet, his face more angry than fearful. Any normal warrior would have been cowed, but Gerion's face was alight at the prospect of so many opponents. "All for me," he mocked. "Truly I am blessed to be able to kill you all." The Berserker King roared in a red fury, his axe sweeping out to take Gerion's head as Pendrag lunged. The swordsman moved like a cat, dodging Otwin's axe and blocking Pendrag's attack with an almost contemptuous flick of one of his swords. Marius's cavalry saber was not intended for dueling, but he wielded its shimmering blade like a veteran fencer. Blood seeped from a knife wound in his side, but only a tightness around his eyes gave any hint of pain he felt from the previous wound. The three of them came on at Gerion together, understanding that to face him singly would be to die. Otwin fought with a maniacal fury, Marius with calculated precision, and Pendrag attacked with a skill born of betrayal. Their axes and swords slashed and stabbed at Gerion, but his twin blades were a blur as he blocked, parried, and counterattacked. He taunted them as he fought, tossing his mane of hair and flashing them his most winning smiles. Pendrag saw past the trap of Gerion's wondrous countenance, as it seemed his fellow counts were also immune to his charms. Otwin was too deep in his berserker rage to be ensnared by petty adornments such as physical perfection, and Marius cared only for gold. Neither man craved solace in beauty, and Gerion's temptations were wasted. Marius cried out as Gerion's sword slid past his guard and sliced through his armor, the swordsman's blow seeking out his wounded side. The Teuton Count dropped to one knee as Gerion spun low to stab his other sword straight into Otwin's thigh. Before Gerion could twist his weapon free, Otwin thundered his fist against Gerion's shoulder. The swordsman staggered but did not release his grip. The Berserker King reached down and took hold of the blade. Gerion twisted his grip, and blood sprayed from the Berserker King's hand. Otwin roared in anger, his muscles swelled, and he snapped Gerion's sword with his bare hand. Otwin fell back with a foot of iron embedded in his leg. Gerion was left with a broken stump of a sword, and his face twisted in petulant anger. Pendrag saw his chance and thrust the runefang at Gerion's exposed chest. The swordsman twisted aside, and Pendrag's blade sliced across the mirrored surface of his breastplate before sliding clear. Gerion threw himself at Pendrag, pulling him close as though for a brotherly embrace. "Too slow," hissed Gerion, and rammed what was left of his broken sword under Pendrag's arm. It punched through his mail shirt and ripped into his heart. Blood burst from Pendrag's mouth, and he heard someone cry his name. The runefang fell from his hand, and the sword spun in fire as he dropped to the parapet. Cold stone slammed into his face, and his chest was bathed in a warm wetness. The sound of battle seemed distant and tiny now, as though coming from some far-away place. It seemed he could hear the sound of distant howling, drawing ever closer. He was cold, so very cold, and he could hear wolves. They were calling to him. For a moment, it seemed that all the warriors posed in a tableau. Otwin's axe, poised to cleave into Gerion's neck. Marius with his curved blade thrusting for his unprotected back. Pendrag lay at their feet, but Gerion's face had a look of loathing and regret etched into it that expressed the greatest of sadness. It was a stark moment of realization for Gerion, as the man he once called a brother lay dead at his feet. He saw how far he had fallen, and feared how far he would go. Grief welled up in him, for Pendrag, for his sister, for himself. A nearby warrior cried out Pendrag's name as they came charging over to the dead count, and time caught up with the dreadful moment. Gerion sidestepped Marius's thrust and bent over backwards to avoid Otwin's axe, which came perilously close to taking the head off the Teuton Count. The swordsman threw aside the instrument of Pendrag's death as though it were red hot, and spun away from the clumsy attack of his enemies. His remaining sword hung limply at his side as tears streamed down his cheeks. If one saw him at that moment, one could think he was suffering the greatest pain imaginable. The fighting at the wall still raged around him, and though he never once took his eyes from Pendrag's body, he blocked and parried with magnificent precision. This new warrior was Mercer, the warrior eternal, the champion of Midland. "You are mine, swordsman," howled the grieving champion, and the howl was taken up by hundreds of throats at his back. Such was the force and fury behind the cries that the surging battle eased, as warriors fighting for their lives turned to seek out the source of the howling. The warriors of Middenheim. They were grim-eyed men who lived harsh lives in the north, not given to open displays of emotion or grief. Yet they came, with tears in their eyes for their fallen count, and the blue and white banner of the city came with them. Gerion, faced with his pain and the oncoming surge of Middenheim warriors, shook his head and threw himself back over the short, hastily constructed wall, as he heard the eternal champion cursing behind him. Thousands of the North Sea warriors still pressed up the viaduct as Azazel retreated from the city. Gerion, feeling a twinge of perception, turned round to see this warrior armed with a crossbow facing him, and in a moment he thought might end his pain and halt his terrible fate. He turned around, stood motionless, his arms outstretched, as he simply said, "I'm sorry." The iron bolt flew from the crossbow, arching over the heads of the North Sea towards Gerion's heart, the two warriors locking eyes, both knowing the bolt was flying true. Then, a chance gust of wind, or the will of the god, who could know? Either way the bolt wavered in flight, as its fletching unraveled. Instead of skewering Gerion's heart, the lethal bolt slammed into his shoulder. Azazel reeled under the impact, But with a final dejected look of disappointment, he turned and fled down the viaduct, beyond the reach of even the greatest of marksmen. Standing at the edge of the forest far below, Car Otterson watched the dark halo around the city on the rock, and knew that its final moments were at hand. He felt every life the demon lord of Karnath took, and the pleasure it gained from such wanton killing coursed like the finest elixir through his flesh. It had taken every scrap of his power to summon so mighty a champion of the blood god, and he had been forced to bind his life force to it to seal the pact. A pack of beasts with heads of snarling bears and wolves clustered close to him, pawing the ground and clawing the air. Their fear spread to their twisted kin around Falstag Rock. Car Otterson rounded on the nearest creature, a towering brute with dark reptilian scales and the head of an enormous horned bull. "What is going on?" he demanded, his mouth thick with the iron taste of blood. The creature didn't answer, and Car Otterson tried to draw on his powers to destroy it, but the weight of the demon lord's presence was too great, and he could summon no trace of his sorcery. The huge beast shook its shaggy head, and spat a mouthful of bloody cud before turning and vanishing into the trees. Its pack followed, and all around the towering spire of rocks, others were doing likewise. "What are you doing?" raged Car Otterson, but the beast ignored him. "They are going home," said a voice choked with self-loathing behind him. Car Otterson turned, and his anger fled as he saw Azazel standing before him. An iron bolt jutted from his pauldron, and his silver armor was streaked with blood. "What in the name of all the dark gods are you doing here?" shouted Car Otterson. "You should be atop the city. You carry the walls of Middenheim and bathe in the flame of Ulrich. I have seen it." "Maybe one day," said Azazel, turning and walking away. "But it will not be today." But as he and many of the beasts left the field of battle, in the face of the howling fury of the Middenheim wolves and the daunting hate-filled aura of the creature that Car Otterson had summoned. Sigmar charged the demon, its mighty form vast and terrible, its dreadful axe a weapon to unmake all life. He ducked beneath a killing sweep and smashed Galmaraz against the demon's flank. Brass armor parted beneath the force of the blow, and more of the demon's black blood sprayed. Where it had melted iron blades and stone, Galmaraz was proof against it, and the demon roared in anger. Its axe chopped down, and Sigmar threw himself to one side. The blade clove the air, but with a dark shimmer it reversed itself upon the haft and slammed into Sigmar's chest. All the malice and rage that had gone into the creation of the demon's axe was in that blow, and it smashed Sigmar's armor asunder. Runes of protection flared white-hot as they were destroyed by the raw elemental power of the blood god, and Sigmar felt the heat burning his skin, forever branding him with the script of the dwarf runesmiths. He felt ribs break and blood burst from his mouth as he was slammed into the fallen ruins of the temple. He fell to the ground beside the flame of Ulrich, still clutching Galmaraz tightly as his armor fell from his body in blackened pieces. He rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow as the demon raised its axe to destroy him. The sound of the wolves echoed through the temple, and the winter wind howled around them. Particles of snow and chips of ice billowed from the fire at the heart of the temple, and Sigmar's chest heaved in pain as the air around him froze. The demon's form hissed as ice and fire met. Sigmar knew with utter certainty that this was the breath of Ulrich himself. Just as surely he knew it was not for him. He heard a warrior shout, a cry of loss and rage, courage and devotion, and a silver sword blade burst from the demon's stomach. Cold fire bathed the blade, its runic surface drawing the breath of Ulrich to it, in a blinding whirl of ice and snow. The demon roared, its essence fighting to prevent its flesh from unraveling in the face of this new power. Sigmar dragged himself to his feet to see the demon transfixed by a warrior in pristine white armor, who drove a dead man's sword into its unnatural flesh. White light surrounded the warrior, and Sigmar saw it was Mercer, the warrior eternal of Middenheim. The breath of Ulrich was not for Sigmar, but for the hero who had pledged his life to the city's defense. The sword with which Mercer had impaled the demon was no longer a weapon forged by mortal hands, but a blinding spike of ice, a shard of the wolf god's power brought to earth to slay the avatar of its enemies. Moment by moment, the demon's form wavered and flickered, its will and power to endure a match for the energies that sought to destroy it. This was Sigmar's one chance, and he knew what he had to do. He held Galmaraz in the flame of Ulrich, letting the cold fire bathe the head of the mighty warhammer in the power of his god. Sigmar pulled his hammer from the flames, its entire length rippling with white fire, and ran towards the demon. He leapt from fallen stone to fallen stone until he was level with the demon's chest and hurled himself towards its horned head. Its eyes blazed, but no demon-born fury could prevent Sigmar from striking. Galmaraz thundered into the demon's chest, and its darkness exploded into shards of night. Fell powers screamed, and the sky was rent asunder as the demon lord's body was torn back to the damned realm from whence it had come. Winter storms raged around the fallen temple, and Sigmar was swept up in the tearing, slicing whirlwind of ice and frozen air. His flesh burned with the bitterest cold, but the touch was not unwelcome, its icy bite familiar and divine. He slammed into the ground, and the breath was driven from his body as the flame of Ulrich surged with life and power. It spread fire over the ground as though an invisible coating of oil covered every surface. The rocks ran with blue flame, and the bodies of the dead leapt with it. The whole world was afire, and it swept out into the city of Middenheim. Like a storm-blown tide, the flame of Ulrich spread through the city, a blazing, seething river of blue fire that echoed with the howls of wolves and frozen winds. It did not burn, yet it roared with the hunger of a mortal blaze, and nothing it touched would ever be the same. A towering pillar of winter fire lifted from the heart of the city, searing the furthest reaches of the sky and spreading its cold light across the land as far as the eye could see. The warriors of Middenheim howled as the power of their god touched them, and their eyes shone with the light of winter. Their blades were death, and the North Sea saw the defeat of the dread lord of Karnath in the cold, merciless eyes of their foes. At each man's side, whether Midlander or not, a shimmering wolf of blue fire snapped and bit at the North Sea, tearing open throats and clawing flesh from bones with ghostly paws. No blade could cut them, no armor could defy them, and the phantom wolves tore into North Sea with all the power of their master. Terror overcame the North Sea, and they scattered before the tide of fiery wolves and winter warriors. The viaduct became a place of certain death, with the wolves of the north and the men of the city hacking down their fleeing foes without mercy. Amid the howls of the wolves and the screaming winds, there came another sound, a sound that defenders of Middenheim had almost despaired of hearing. Great horns blowing wildly from a host of men. They came from the forests, the swords of tens of thousands of men from all across the empire. Only 2 souls escaped the empire's vengeance, a weeping swordsman in silver armor, and a screaming madman whose eyes ran red with blood. They fled into the shadows, where the beasts were waiting for them. On the desolate Norscan coast, a ship is set aflame, a floating funeral pyre for a past chieftain of the North Sea tribe. From a cave mouth high on the cliffs above, a man in tattered furs and a cloak of feathers watched the last voyage of the doomed wolf ship. His face was bearded, and long hair hung in matted ropes from his head. Once it had been jet black, but it is now so wadded with mud and dirt that its true color had long since been obscured. The filth of living in a cave encrusted his skin, and his arms were rank with sores and rashes that burned and tingled pleasurably in equal measure. The villagers called him Vertgion, though he could make little sense of the word. What he had bothered to learn of their language allowed him only the most basic understanding. A fetish-draped shaman had spat it at him 1.5 years ago, when he and the wizened immortal stepped from the wolf ship. Though he did not know its meaning, it was a name to hide behind, a shield to hold before the deeds of his true name. The immortal had left the village, imploring him to travel onwards into the northern wastes, but he had refused, climbing the cliff and making this cave his home. He knew he should have gone. His presence here would draw the hunters, but something had kept him from leaving, as though invisible shackles had held him here. The immortal had given him a cloth-wrapped bundle as they fled across the ocean, and even without unwrapping it, he knew what lay within. How such a thing was possible was a mystery. He had thrown it away in the wake of defeat, yet there it was. he kept it wedged in a cleft at the back of the cave. He knew he should hurl it into the sea, but he also knew he would not. Something moved in the fog, and he lifted a hand to shield his eyes from the winter sun. A phantom of the mist, or something darker. His right hand twitched with the memory of slaughter, and his gaze slid towards the settlement as old instincts and new senses prickled with danger. From out of the fog, a dozen ships cut through the water towards the village. Powerful sweeps of oars drove the ships onwards, and their decks were crammed with armed men in gleaming iron breastplates and full-face helms of bronze. They clutched axes and swords and spears, and he sensed their anger, even from high on the cliff. He looked back onto the cave, but closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He feared this moment ever since he stepped onto the shore, but now that it was here, he found himself utterly calm. The same calm he felt before a duel. The same calm he felt before he killed. He watched the ship surge through the crashing breakers and slide up the shingle beach. The village's few warriors ran to meet them, with axes held high over their shoulders, old men and youngsters mainly. 50 men of sword-bearing age were all that were left to defend the village, nowhere near enough. Whooping war shouts echoed from the stony beach as women and children ran towards the cliffs. There was no escape. There was just the postponement of the inevitable. These warriors would leave no survivors. They never did. Even isolated in this cave, he had heard the recent scare stories of the seaborne raiders, the killers from across the ocean, who wiped out entire tribes in their vengeful slaughter. Their crimson and white sails were the terror of the coastline, a sight to drive fear into the hearts of those that had once been masters of the ocean. A score of armed men dropped from the lead ship, led by a warrior in gleaming silver armor and a gold-crowned helm. He bore a mighty warhammer and smashed one of the village warriors from his feet with a single blow. More ships breached, and in moments 100 warriors were ashore. Arrows leapt from the decks of the ships, serrated tips slicing into the proud flesh, and flame-wrapped barbs landing amid the tinder-dry homes of the villagers. A dozen warriors were dropping into the surf with every passing second. Though the defenders of the settlement were hopelessly outnumbered, they fought with the fury of warriors given one last chance to reclaim their honor in death. Lightly armored men with bows fanned out onto the beach, taking aim at the fleeing villagers and cutting them down with lethally accurate shafts. Iron clashed with iron on the shore as the last of the defenders were overwhelmed. He watched a raven-helmed warrior hurl himself at the leader of these reavers from the sea, with his axe slashing down over his head. The warhammer swept up, and the blade slammed down on its haft. Such a blow would have shattered any normal weapon and split the enemy's skull, but he knew this was no ordinary warhammer, nor was the warrior who bore it any ordinary foe. The warhammer spun in the warrior's hand faster than any weapon of such weight and power should move. Its head slammed into the raven helm's face, caving his skull into shards and knocking him to the red snow. "No pyre for you," he said as the warriors from the sea advanced into the settlement. Its buildings were burned and its people dead. Yet the raiders kicked them down, leaving nothing standing to indicate that anyone had once called this bay home. There was no raid for gold or slaves or plunder. This was an attack of destruction. The raiders hauled the bodies of the defenders from the sea and began stripping their helmets one by one. The warrior with the warhammer bent to look at their faces, but each time he would shake his head in disappointment. Whitgiron chuckled as the warrior shook his head and hissed, "You won't find what you're looking for among the dead." He heard a noise from further down the cliff and pulled back into the shadow of the cave mouth. A slender, hard-faced woman carried a pair of children up the icy cliff paths towards his cave. Her steps were faltering, and he saw a pair of arrows jutting from her back. She saw him and tried to speak, but no words came, only a froth of bubbling blood. She reached the ledge before his cave and collapsed on her knees. Her eyes were frantic. Only seconds of life remained to her, and she knew it. "Save my children," she said in a language not of her own. He backed away from her, shaking his head. "You must," she said, thrusting the youngsters towards him. He saw they were twins, one boy, the other a girl. Both howled with uncontrollable sobs. The woman's eyes closed, and she swayed back as death reached up to claim her. The woman's daughter threw her arms around her mother's neck, and the pair of them fell from the cliff, falling 100 yards into the sea. The warriors on the shoreline saw them fall, their eyes drawn up to the cave on the cliff. He knew he was invisible in the shadows, but the boy stood on the ledge as plain as day. 4 warriors ran from the beach towards the cliff paths as the man cursed. He felt a tugging at his fur jerkin and looked down into the coldest blue eyes he had ever seen. The boy stood with his fists bunched at his sides, and there was pleading desperation in the way he met the man's gaze. "You are Wertgeron," said the boy in the man's own tongue. "Why did you not come down and fight them?" "Because I have no wish to commit suicide," he replied. "They've killed my tribe. Why won't you kill them?" wept the boy. "I will kill anyone who tries to kill me," said the man. "Good," said the boy. "Zek Ashkan said you were a great warrior." "I don't know who that is." "The shaman who named you Wertgeron. Lord Etulf wanted you and your friend slain, but Zek Ashkar said you were a killer of men, and that we should let you live in the cave." "Did he now?" replied the man. "I wonder why. Perhaps it was to save your life." 4 warriors were climbing towards them, carefully picking their way along the treacherous path. They carried long knives, eschewing axes on so narrow a ledge. The man watched them come, confident, arrogant, and with a swagger that didn't match their abilities. He'd watched them fight on the shore. They were competent warriors, but no more than that. "There's a passage at the back of the cave," said the man. "It leads through the rock and comes out a few miles north of the village. Wait for me there. I will join you shortly." "I don't want to run," said the boy, and the man saw fierce determination behind his fear. "No," he agreed. "You don't. But sometimes that's all you can do." "What do you mean?" "Nothing," said the man. "It doesn't matter. But I now know why I did not leave this cave." Before the boy could ask any more, the light at the mouth of the cave was blocked as 2 of the warriors reached his squalid dwelling place. "Get behind me," said the man, pushing the boy away. The first warrior stepped cautiously into the cave, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. A second followed close behind, the blades of their knives glittering in the dim light. "What do we have here?" he said, his voice heavily accented. "A hermit and a shit-scared boy? Should be nice and easy, lads." "You should go and never come back," said the man, his voice calm and even. "You know that ain't gonna happen," said the warrior. "I know," agreed the man, leaping forwards with dazzling speed before the warrior was even aware he was under attack. The man slammed the heel of his hand against the warrior's throat. Windpipe crushed. The warrior dropped to his knees, already choking to death. The man caught the falling dagger and plunged it into the throat of the second warrior. The blade sliced into the gap between his iron torque and the visor of his helm. He gave a strangled gargle and toppled to the ground as his lifeblood squirted over his killer and the walls of the cave. Lethal instincts returned with a vengeance as the hot stink of blood filled the man's nostrils. He leapt, feet first, towards the remaining 2 warriors. His booted feet slammed into a chest encased in a heavy hauberk of iron-linked rings, and the warrior was pitched from the ledge, arms flailing as he fell to his death. The man landed lightly as the last warrior thrust a dagger towards his guts. He swayed aside, locking the warrior's arms beneath his own, and sent 2 lightning-quick stabs of his purloined dagger through the visor of his victim's helmet. "No glorious sights in the halls of Ulrich for you," hissed the man, letting the body fall from the ledge to dash itself on the rocks far below. He stood on the edge of the rocky spit of stone before his cave, his arms and upper body drenched in blood. His heart should be racing, yet it beat with a casual rhythm, as though he rested in a peaceful meadow beneath the clearest sky. Looking down at the beach, he saw the raiders staring up in horror. The warrior in the gold-crowned helm met his gaze. A dozen men ran for the cliff path with murder in their hearts. The man threw the dagger away and returned to the cave, moving with grim inevitability to the cleft in the rock. Quickly he pulled out a pitch-blackened bundle of cloth and carefully undid the rotting length of twine that secured it. The boy looked on in wonder as he revealed a glittering sword with an ivory handle and gold inlaid hilt. The blade was slightly curved in the manner of the Taliatan horseman, and it shone like fresh minted silver. His hands closed around the hilt like a long-lost friend, and he sighed as though welcoming a midnight lover. "Zed Askar was right," said the boy. "You are a great warrior, Ritgerin. "I am the greatest warrior," said the man, stripping the sword belt from the first man he had killed. He slid his own blade home. It was a loose fit, the scabbard designed for an Umberogan stabbing sword. "And do not call me Whitgerin. It is not my name." "It isn't?" "No. My name is Azazel," he said, letting the name settle in his mouth, as though he hadn't really earned it until now. The boy looked up at him with a mixture of awe and wariness. Azazel smiled, and put his hand on the boy's shoulder, leading him towards the hidden passageway through the rocks. The warriors pursuing him would find the entrance, but they would never find them in the warren of tunnels that lay beyond. The boy looked back at the slice of light at the cave's mouth and hesitated. "There's no going back," said Azazel. "There never is." This had been Azazel's 40th summer, and he watched with the boy from a concealed ledge further along the cliffs. A rutted track twisted through the rocks and defiles behind them, leading down towards the bleak landscape of the north. Beyond the cliffs, the arcing wide vista became ever more irregular, a harsh mix of tundra, ice shelf, and blasted wilderness. The horizon shimmered, and the boundary between earth and sky blurred, as though the difference between them was maddeningly inconsistent. Beyond the horizon, Azazel knew the world grew stranger still, the land no longer bound by the laws of nature and man. It was a shifting realm of nightmares and chaos, its character broken and bitter, like a land shaped by spiteful gods. Azazel smiled, knowing that was exactly true. He could feel the breath of northern powers sweeping down from the realm of the gods, laden with ruin and eons-old malice. He and Car Odison had ventured far into the forsaken wilderness, traveling paths known only to madmen or those whose lungs drew breath of air touched by the great gods of the north. It had changed them both, though Azazel remembered little of the journey, save the monumental tomb of an ancient warrior and a duel with its guardian. The quest into the north had reshaped him in ways beyond his comprehension. His body was faster and stronger than was humanly possible, and his senses were honed to preternatural levels. Those senses now told him he would venture into that wilderness again. They were silent as to whether he would ever return. He and the boy had threaded their way through the tunnels of the cliffs, finally emerging onto a sheltered ledge high on the flank of the mountain. They lay in a concealed ravine, high above the soaring white cliffs that marked the boundary of this icy realm, watching as black smoke from the burning settlement pressed down on the bay like a mourning shroud. 134 people had lived there, mostly women and children, with 50 men to bear swords. All were now dead, slain by a man he had once called a friend. Azazel hadn't known any of the villagers and felt nothing at their deaths. Everyone had been slain, but this one boy had survived, and that had to mean something, didn't it? Azazel looked down at the young boy. He was clean-limbed, strong for his age, with a shock of hair so blonde it was almost white. His high cheekbones were characteristic of the North Sea tribes, and Azazel saw he would grow into a strikingly handsome man. Tears cut through the grime on his young face, his body racked with sobs now that the adrenaline of fear had worn off. Azazel sensed the confluence of fates in their meeting, the twisted schemes of higher powers at work. Car Odison would have said it was the will of the gods that had brought them together, but the shaman had been raving and delusional when Azazel had last seen him. Perhaps it was the will of the gods, but who could tell? Anything could be interpreted as a sign of the gods, and it was no use trying to guess their intent. All he could do was follow his instincts, and his instincts were telling him this boy was special in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. He returned his attention to the south, watching as the crimson sails of the raiders from the Empire pushed out to sea, past where the Norscan chieftain's wolf ship had sunk beneath the waves. The ships cleared the headland, but instead of turning along the coastline to seek fresh slaughter, they kept going, aiming their tapered brows to the south. "Are they going home?" asked the boy. Azazel nodded. "It looks like it, yes." "Good," sobbed the boy. Azazel slapped him hard, knocking him back onto his haunches. Instantly the boy was on his feet, his grief swapped by anger. He reached for a sword that wasn't there, and hurled himself at Azazel. "I'll kill you!" he screamed. Azazel sidestepped his rush and pushed the boy to the ground. Before the boy could rise, he planted a booted foot in his chest. "Anger is not your friend, boy," said Azazel. "Learn to control it, or I will throw you from these cliffs. Listen to me and listen well. You are the last of your tribe. No other will take you in except as a slave, and the land will kill you if you do not start using your head. We are to travel into the north, and you will do exactly as I say, or it will be death for us both. I will teach you what you need to survive, but if you ever disobey me even once, I will kill you. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded. His grief and anger were gone, replaced by smoldering resentment. That was good. It was a beginning. He held his hand out to the boy, hauling him to his feet. An angry red mark burned on his cheek where Azazel had struck him. "That is the first lesson I will teach you," said Azazel. "It won't be the last, but it will be the least painful." The boy regarded him coldly, rubbing his cheeks and holding himself straighter. "Look out there," said Azazel, pointing out to the ocean. "What do you see?" "The raiders' ships," said the boy. "Yes, they are going home to a land that hates you. Will they be back? I doubt it. Southerners don't tend to do well with this cold." The boy looked at him with a sneer curling his lips. "You say we like you are one of us. I am more part of this land than you will ever be," Azazel promised him. He turned from the diminishing ships, setting a brisk pace along the path over the cliffs. This was the first day of their journey, and who knew how long it would last. The boy trotted after him, throwing careful glances towards the smoke rising from the ruin of his home. "Will we ever come back here?" he asked. "Oh yes, one day we will. I promise. It will be many years from now, but we will return, and we will avenge all that has befallen us." "Good," said the boy, his jaw clenched, his blue eyes cold and dead. Azazel paused in his march as though a thought occurred to him. "What is your name, boy? What do they call you?" The boy drew his shoulders back and said, "I am called Morcar. Morcar, the future first ever chosen." Mystery surrounds what happened to Azazel and Morcar after they entered the Chaos Wastes. It is presumed that it was Azazel who raised and taught the first ever chosen. The history of the first ever chosen himself is steeped in conflicts and vagaries, but at some point the two parted ways. In the Wastes, Azazel played his part in the great game between the Chaos Gods, leading forces of Slaanesh for his chosen sire, having dedicated himself to the Dark Prince when Ka-Oddison had first taken him into the Wastes all those years ago. Although he had failed to be the tool the Dark Powers hoped to use to strike down Sigmar, his efforts had met with approval from his chosen deity. In the Wastes, he rose quickly in the Pleasure God's favor for his constant acts of devotion and debauchery. Time being the nebulous concept it is in the Chaos Wastes, it is unknown when, but Azazel and his forces were faced with a 10,000-strong host of the worshippers of Khorne, the most hated of Slaanesh's dark siblings. The Khornate host was led by one of Khorne's most valued champions, Arthur. The fighting was fierce, and as the battle reached its apex, the two champions came face to face. The frenzied and violent brutality of the champion of Khorne was met with the speed and grace of the consummate swordsman that was Azazel. Azazel's grace won out, as Arthur fell into a puddle of his own blood, blood which his god so cherished. Ecstatic at the accomplishment of his champion, Slaanesh bestowed the ultimate blessing on Azazel, raising him to demonhood. His smooth skin turned the color of porcelain, wings erupted out of his back of the purest white, their beauty unmatched by swans or any other creature of nature. 2 lacquered horns crunched out of his skull to crown his handsome brow. His left hand hardened into a claw, delicate and deadly, a form favored by his master. His beauteous locks of jet black hair, always a point of pride for Azazel, remained, and the slightest breeze could agitate his glossy mane, so that it rose like a dark halo around his head, adding to his already considerable glory. His eyes now seemed full of innocence, yet just beneath the surface one can glean that they are cruel, calculating, and without pity. Azazel's gifts were not just physical, for now he could see into the hearts and souls of men. Their deepest desires and hidden passions were now plain to him. In his new form, it is said that the beauty of Azazel is second only to that of his patron. But as irresistible as his beauty is, there is a deadly edge to it. Those who have gazed upon him never forget the sensual temptation his presence arouses. It is a beauty which evokes loathing, and a temptation that sickens the soul. Having now ascended, Slaanesh placed Azazel in command of his armies, and since that day, the forces of the Prince of Chaos have enjoyed one blissful triumph after another, as Azazel soars over battlefield after battlefield. In truth, most of Azazel's opponents give up the fight before it even begins, for few can bring themselves to harm such an enchanting and wondrous being as Azazel. The Prince of Damnation, however, has no qualms about harming them. In the domain of Slaanesh, east of the Vale of Creatures, is a great mountain that serves as Azazel's seat of power. There he sits on his throne of crystal quartz, bedecked in robes of the finest silks and adorned with gorgeous jewels and shining gems. Thousands of adoring supplicants gather at the feet of his throne, offering gifts and their praises. From time to time, Azazel will leap into the sky and soar across the mauve light of the heavens, sweeping low over the throng that had gathered around his throne, some to embrace, and others to strike dead as the whim took him. Azazel has been the bane of humanity since time immemorial, and when he does venture back into the mortal realm, it is more often than not the realms of men that pay the price. In a couple of notable examples of his excursions, it is known that once, at the Battle of the Moors, a force of zealous Templars of Ulrich had made vows before the flame of Ulrich in Middenheim that they would banish Azazel or perish trying. But before the battle ended, the Templars had been reduced to gibbering imbeciles, slaves to the slightest whim of Azazel. He set collars around their necks, and made them walk on all fours like dogs to amuse his patron Slaanesh. Long have the warriors of Middenheim sworn a pact of vengeance against Azazel, for he had killed their first Elector Count, and to add this shame to his lists of misdeeds against them, and only served to reinforce their determination to wipe him from the mortal realm once and for all. The lands of Bretonnia have not been immune to the temptations of Azazel either, and in a most infamous case, the questing knight Guido de Brion sought out Azazel, intending to challenge him to single combat to fulfill his Grail quest. But instead he kneeled before the demon prince, begging him to accept his undying devotion. Laughing, Azazel severed the head of the Bretonnian knight, who stood unmoving, convinced in the justification of the act. Woe to those who fight Azazel, the right hand of Slaanesh. And that, ladies and gentlemen, about wraps up our tale of Azazel, the Prince of Damnation, the leader of the Ecstatic Legions. In terms of his rules on the tabletop, he could fly, cause terror, his great claw added extra strength attacks, his dark halo gave him a 50% ward save, and his striking tail lowered the attacks of the enemy combatants. He'd also have the ability to be the Tempter, where, given a leadership test, if failed by a character in base-to-base contact with Azazel, that character would then join his army for the rest of the game. And he was, of course, a master of sorcery. His weapon was the Demon Blade. Now, whether this is the same blade that he carried when he was a mortal man before he wandered back into the Chaos Wastes, it's never really clarified. I assume it is. They make a big deal out of it. It's never depicted the same way in the stories as it is in his model, so I'm never really sure if it is the same Demon Blade or he's given the Demon Blade upon his ascension. But with the Demon Blade, it's basically a weapon that doesn't allow any armor saving throws against it, and is of course a blade with a living demon inhabiting it. And that's about it for Azazel, ladies and gentlemen. If you like this, please do check out some of my other lore stories. But as always, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright guys, bye.